Welcome to the Faith and Focus podcast. I'm Laura, and today we're exploring Plato's theory of forms and why it shaped so many later arguments about God in OCR A-level religious studies. So let me begin with something that's really quite deceptively simple. 3 questions. When you say something is good, what do you mean? When you say something is beautiful, compared to what? When you say something is true, how do you know? So Plato's philosophy begins with a discomfort that the physical world changes, opinions change, bodies decay, political systems rise and fall and collapse. And so if reality is always shifting, then how is knowledge secure? So Plato answers this, and it's quite a radical thing, and he says, well, actually, what you think is true reality isn't, what you're seeing isn't reality, and what doesn't change is real reality, but you don't know that. And if that sounds completely confusing, then I will break that down. But once you understand it, then you will see why these ideas are so fundamental to the rest of the philosophy of religion spec, and also why it underpins so much of theology and religious studies in general. So what does Plato actually say? So for Plato, the metaphysical framework has 2 realms. So he argues that reality exists at 2 levels. So the first level, that's the physical realm. So that's the one that is changing all the time, is imperfect, it's a material realm, and it's what we know through our senses. So it's seeing, touching, tasting, etc. And then he says the other realm is the realm of the forms. And the realm of the forms is not a physical realm, it's eternal, it's perfect, and it's what we know through our reason. So it's what we know through logic and thought and reasonable thinking. So the forms aren't ideas, they are objective realities. So there is, for example, the form of beauty, there is the form of justice, there is the form of equality. And for Plato, there is a form for pretty much everything, but then the ultimate and important one is Plato's idea of the form of the good. And Plato thinks that that idea is important because he's trying to solve a problem of universals. So it's not an individualized thing that he's trying to address. It's a universal problem that he's trying to address. So he's trying to say, well, how can all these different things that we call beautiful be what we would call, in inverted commas, beautiful, unless they've got something in common? So if there's no standard of beauty in that instance, then what is beautiful? It's a nonsense term, and it's about your opinion rather than objective reality. And Plato wanted objective reality. He wanted stability, and he wanted to know that knowledge couldn't be undermined, and our perception couldn't undermine what we saw and knew was real, because that's not how it works. So again, at the top of the hierarchy, you've got the form of the good. So the form of the good shines a light on all of the other forms. We wouldn't know any of the other forms if it wasn't for the form of the good. It's like the top of the pyramid. And it grounds everything else. It grounds truth. Truth comes from the form of the good into everything else. And then it makes knowledge possible. So think about it, like Plato compares it to the sun. So he says, without a sun, we couldn't see anything on earth. Right, we need the sun to make things visible, and the form of the good is like that for all the other forms. That's where the connection to later religious thought becomes clear, because it links to that idea of what becomes later the Judeo-Christian idea of God, and that we cannot understand anything without God first revealing things to us and stuff like that. So the form of the good resembles a necessary foundation, it's a source of being, and it's a metaphysical absolute. So it's an absolute thing. It's there, that's what it is. And again, many theologians later on, many scholars later on, see the beginnings in Plato of what later becomes our understanding of a Judeo-Christian God. So that's a really brief overview of the form of the good and what it is. So let's think about scholars. And I think it's important to think about scholars. I would hope at this point you've got the knowledge of the actual form of the good and everything. But what people forget is scholars. And I'm trying to give you supporting scholars and I'm trying to give you contrasting scholars. So let's start with the supporting scholars. So who builds on or defends Plato? So first of all, we've got St. Augustine. Okay, so St. Augustine integrates Plato into his Christian theology. So he would say that the form exists in the mind of God. That's why the form of the good is God. God is the source of that eternal truth, and human souls long for the divine because that's where we originate. That's where we start from. We want to go back to the divine because that's where we started. And so Augustine essentially baptizes Plato. So he kind of makes him a Christian indirectly. And so for Augustine, Plato provides a rational foundation for Christian metaphysics. Bearing in mind that obviously Plato and Aristotle are Greek, they are not Christians, because it doesn't exist yet. Okay, then later on, going into like 20th century, we've got somebody called Alvin Plantinga. Now you should be familiar with Alvin Plantinga, I hope. So Plantinga, he hangs everything on this idea of divine attributes depending on perfection being coherent. So if you haven't got maximal greatness and a concept of what maximal greatness is, i.e. the form of the good, then everything else falls apart. So he would then relate that to something like the ontological argument for the existence of God, because he would say that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Well, if you don't know what greatness is, and you can't conceive of maximal greatness, then how can you have an ontological argument? So it's that emphasis on perfection from Plato that makes Plantinga's understanding of the ontological argument possible. And then we have somebody called Iris Murdoch. So she defends the concept of the good as a real, transcendent, moral reality. So she would say that moral improvement requires orientation towards something objective. It's got to be beyond us and, I suppose, out there. Reachable but beyond us. And so for her, that concept of moral improvement requiring this like orientation towards a better thing, that is exactly what Plato is trying to say. That these forms and the form of the good is pulling us towards it indirectly. So we'll come to the contrasting scholars later. What I wanted to do first is talk about the analogy of the cave. This should be, I hope, relatively simple by this point, so I'm not going to spend loads of time explaining it. But essentially you've got the idea of the cave. There are philosophers in the cave and they are watching the wall. There's a fire behind them. The shadows are being cast by the fire onto the wall, and the philosophers think that what is on the wall is reality. Okay, that is our Plato saying to us, you think this is reality, but it's not. It's just a physical world, a sense world, if you like. One philosopher escapes from the cave, goes out into what is the real world, the world of the forms, and sees all of these perfect ideas and realises that what he's been looking at and all the other philosophers are looking at is not true. And then he goes back into the cave to tell people about it all. That is a metaphor for what Plato thinks that philosophers should do. Once you've realised that this world is not the real world and it's not reality, and it's the form of the good and the world of the forms that's reality, then we have a duty, once we've understood that, to go and tell everybody else about it. So, why is that important? So, Plato prioritises reason over sense experience. So what the philosophers are seeing in the cave is irrelevant. It's what the philosopher who goes outside the cave and sees that is the important part. Okay, and that shapes rationalist arguments, it shapes a priori reasoning, and it shapes different proofs that come later on, particularly from Christianity. And something that we'll come on to in other things is this idea of Plato being a substance dualist. So he believes that the mind and the body are separate to each other. Okay? So he says that the soul is immaterial, the body is temporary, and true knowledge belongs to the soul. So the body is irrelevant, it dies, it fades away. But true knowledge rests in the soul. And so that will then underpin things that, for example, Descartes talks about later on when he talks about the mind, body and soul. So again, it's a fundamental basis for what comes later in philosophy. Okay, so let's look at some evaluation, some critiques of Plato. So the really obvious one that you will be potentially expected to contrast Plato with in an exam question is Aristotle. So Aristotle completely rejects the idea of forms. He gets rid of that entirely. And he says that form exists within an object. There isn't an entire other realm made up of these perfect forms. All right? There's no need to duplicate reality, and there's no need to inflate your ideas in this way. It's quite simple. The world is what it is. Everything that is a form exists within this realm and within the object, not somewhere else. That's it. You will have heard words like immanent and transcendent in relation to a Christian idea of God. You can argue that this idea of the forms and things like that, this is relevant in terms of Plato is talking about a transcendent being, if you like, a thing. The form of the good is transcendent. It's not in this world. It doesn't interact with it. But Aristotle is talking about an immanent world. Okay? So this supreme being is an immanent thing. Okay, and then we've got something called the third man argument. You've got the forms, and you've got objects that are similar. But what explains the similarity between the form and the object? It's like you need another thing to describe that, which then defies the point of the forms. So that can be a bit, it like spins around in a circle. You never get to the answer. And Plato doesn't seem to be able to fully resolve that either. Another critique would be David Hume. So David Hume rejects this idea of non-empirical universals. Plato's got no evidence for this. It's ontological, it's reasoned out, it's logical, but there's no evidence. And Hume would reject that and say, well, we can't have anything that's not based on empirical evidence. And you experience patterns and things that are familiar because you've done it so often. So it's not a form, it's not a secondary thing. It's I've been a human being for this many years and I've seen the sky this many times, so I know what the sky is, So David Hume would reject Plato entirely and say we don't need eternal forms. It's not a thing that we should worry about. Bertrand Russell criticises Plato and he says he's very abstract, overly abstract, and it's disconnected from empirical verification. So this idea that can you verify the thing that you are talking about? If you can't, then it's meaningless. Modern analytic philosophy tends towards clarity and logical structure rather than dualism. So it's almost like we've moved away from that now. So does it really serve its function anymore because the world is different and the views are different anyway? Modern scientific critiques would say that evolutionary biology and cognitive science can explain why we form universal concepts. So psychology, cognitive science, evolutionary biology, all of these disciplines have obviously come into being and exist now that didn't exist when Plato and Aristotle were forming their opinions. So do we still need something like the idea of the forms anymore? Because we know more now anyway. Okay, so I want to think now about high-level evaluation. So if you were to get an exam question on the forms, on Plato, how would you go about thinking about it? So if you are looking to get the highest level marks, you've got to think about what the question is that you are actually being asked. So to get the highest level answers, obviously depending on the question, you would focus it accordingly. But the question is really, it's not saying yes, the forms are real or no, they aren't, and here's why. It's saying, is Plato necessary so that we can have objective truth? And if you accept Plato, how do you avoid this idea of metaphysical excess? So all this extra fluff, how do you avoid all of that? How do you justify a separate realm when we are expanding our knowledge of the universe and science and we can't find anything like that? If you reject Plato, how do you ground moral objectivity? What does it sit within if there's no such thing as like a form of the good or whatever? How do you defend necessary existence? So what becomes later the Judeo-Christian idea of God is a necessary being. If you haven't got the forms, have you got a necessary being? And then, how do you explain universals? How do you explain things that apply all the time? So, any strong essay about Plato and Aristotle will think about, is it necessary to ground truth rather than is it real? Right? Is it real is GCSE thinking. We are at A level and we need to extend our argument, basically, beyond the obvious. So, a strong essay compares Plato and Aristotle, and it will judge which framework supports later religious arguments. So that's what you're thinking. You're thinking, in the end, we get to Christianity, and we get to all the things that you've learned in, DCT, etc. You get to those from Plato and Aristotle. So which one's better as a foundation for those later arguments? That's what you need to be considering. So Plato matters for OCR because it underpins so many other things. So it underpins Anselm's ontological argument, as we've already discussed. It underpins Aquinas, especially when you're talking about arguments for the existence of God. It underpins Christian ideas of divine perfection. The form of the good is a perfect thing, while God is also a perfect thing. It matters because it underpins the idea of dualism, which comes later in Mind, Body and Soul. And it also underpins religious language, because the way that he talks about it comes up in religious language later on. Is the language that he uses of any use to describe it anyway? Along with Aristotle, Plato is basically the foundation and the skeleton of the whole thing. So if you take Plato away, everything else gets weaker instantly. So this arc of podcasts that we're going to look at in terms of philosophy of religion is going to come under this title, How Do We Know? And so at the end of every podcast, we'll go back to that season title and say, what is their answer? So Plato's answer of how do we know is that we know through rational access to eternal realities. And whether that answer convinces you or not, it at least forces you to confront what knowledge actually is and what it needs. So, next episode, we will look at Aristotle. So, Aristotle is a student of Plato and he challenges him straight away. And he challenges the entire framework. So, where Plato transcends things, Aristotle grounds in it. And it's that kind of tension that's built between the two that is important to understand in philosophy of religion and important to demonstrate in your essays. So thank you for listening to today's episode of the Faith and Focus podcast. So hopefully today you've learned about Plato's theory of the forms, the form of the good. We've touched on dualism, some key supporting scholars, some key critics. Next time we're going to look at Aristotle's four causes and the idea of the prime mover, and look at how his philosophy reshapes arguments about God. So make sure to subscribe, share and follow us on @Faith and Focus Podcast for more revision tools, tips and resources. And until next time, stay curious, keep questioning and keep learning. Bye!